The space station floated like a cold giant above the shadow of a distant blue planet, its curved metal body humming softly with life and movement. Species of all kinds walked, its wide corridors their languages echoing against smooth silver walls. The station was a place of trade, of talk, of power, and of things forgotten too easily by those who did not wish to remember them. In the center market where vendors called out in strange voices, and machines blinked their offers in glowing text, there stood a cage unlike the others around it. It was not for weapons or tools or food, it was for something breathing, something small and quiet and too intelligent to be here. Her skin was a soft violet, marked with silver lines like veins or tattoos. Her hair fell in tangled threads over her shoulders, and her large eyes were not dull like the other creatures in cages. They were alert, watching every movement, every step, every whisper. They were not the eyes of a pet, they were the eyes of someone who knew she had been stolen from a life she could barely remember. She sat with her legs folded close, her arms wrapped around them, her gaze following each passerby, not begging, not pleading, just watching as if searching for something, a sign, a reason, a way out, and yet none stopped to look at her. Not truly. A few children laughed and pointed. Their parents dragged them away, muttering about expensive decorations or exotic breeds. None of them saw her for what she really was. Someone did. His name was David, a simple human engineer working deep in the tech bays of the station. He wore plain clothes, spoke little, and stayed to himself most of the time. His job was to repair damaged systems, check fuel lines, recalibrate older consoles. Nothing special, and yet he was different from those who walked past her each day. Because when he saw her, he stopped at first he thought she was a pet like the sign said, but something in the way she looked at him made him pause. Her eyes met his, not with fear, not with submission, but with quiet intensity, as if she knew he was someone who might listen, someone who might understand. And for a moment, they just stared at each other, the noise of the market fading around them. Her hand moved slightly, not a wave, not a greeting, more like a test to see if he would notice, and he did. He gave the smallest nod, and then walked away. He could not forget her. That night he sat in his small room in the workers' wing, staring at his ceiling, thinking about those eyes. They had not left his mind all day. They were not the eyes of a creature trained to obey. They were the eyes of someone who had been broken and was still fighting inside. He accessed the station's database, searching for her species. The system had her listed as non-sentient, background, unknown, domestication, approved across multiple sectors. No records of culture, no mention of language, no history, nothing more than a name in a file, and that made no sense. He had seen the way she looked around her, the way her hands moved when someone came close, how she flinched not from instinct, but from memory. There was pain behind those reactions. Not animal fear, but the memory of punishment, of being treated like an object. And David began to wonder how many others like her had been locked in cages while the galaxy moved on, calling them decorative and harmless and dumb. The next day he went back. She was still there, her head resting on her knees, her arms folded tight. But when he appeared, her eyes lifted again, slowly, carefully, as if she did not trust what she was seeing. And when he took one step closer, her body tensed, not with hope, but with habit. She had learned not to expect kindness, and that made his chest tighten. The vendor was a thick-skinned merchant with sharp teeth and a laugh like broken glass. He called her a rare find, a low-maintenance display piece, not much for tricks, but quiet and pretty and easy to feed. David asked if she had ever spoken. The vendor laughed, said she made noises, sometimes copied things, but never really talked, nothing useful anyway, and then shrugged, said maybe she was just broken like some of the others. David left without speaking further, but his mind was already moving through plans and options. He began researching station law, reviewing the pet ownership codes. There were loopholes, clauses about mistreatment, about transfer of ownership in cases of abuse. It was not easy, and it was not fast, but it was legal, and David had made his choice. On the third day, he returned with a form in hand. The vendor scoffed until he saw the official seal, then scowled. but said nothing. He handed over the cage code and turned away without a word, and that was it. The girl was as legally removed from abuse, reassigned under humanitarian protocol. She had no idea what had happened, only that the door of the cage opened, and a hand was reaching toward her, not to hit, not to command, just to help. She flinched and looked up uncertain, and when David spoke, his voice was calm and steady and quiet. He told her she was free now. She did not have to be scared anymore. He would not hurt her, he would not keep her. And then he gently reached in and removed the collar around her neck, tossing it aside. Like the trash it was, she stared at him, wide-eyed, frozen in place, unable to move or speak. And he did not push her, he just waited. After a long moment, she stepped forward, her steps shaky and slow, as if each movement might bring pain, but it didn't. And slowly, carefully, she followed him away from the market, down the hall, away from the noise and the stairs and the metal bars. She didn't know where she was going or what would happen next, but she knew one thing for sure. For the first time in a long time, the air around her did not smell like fear, and behind her in the empty stall, the collar lay forgotten on the ground, no longer attached to a name, no longer holding a soul that deserved to be free. The corridors of the station stretched long and silver under dim artificial lights, their quiet hum blending with the faint sounds of voices and footsteps echoing through the halls. And as the girl walked beside David, her steps uncertain, her body still tense with the memory of years inside the cage, she kept glancing sideways at him, trying to understand who he was and why he had done what he did for her when no one else ever had. She followed him in silence through narrow walkways, past doors that opened and closed with quiet clicks, her eyes shifting from blinking signs to tall figures passing by, none of whom paid her any attention here. She was not being stared at like a rare toy, not being pulled or prodded. She was invisible in a way that almost felt like safety, and yet she could not quite believe it was real. Not yet. David lived in a small section of the workers' district, a quiet corner of the lower levels, filled with plain doors and soft lights. His room was not large, but it was clean, simple, and warm. A table, a bed, a screen on the wall, a corner with storage, and another with tools he used for repairs. He motioned toward the soft seat near the wall, then stepped back, giving her space, not touching her, not speaking too much, just showing her she could choose what to do next. She did not sit at first. Instead, she stood near the door, eyes scanning the room as if checking for traps or chains or collars, and when none appeared, she moved to the seat, slowly lowering herself onto it as if expecting pain. But nothing came, only silence and space, and his quiet presence across the room as he poured water into a cup and placed it on the table near her before stepping away again. She reached for the cup with trembling fingers, sniffed it first, then took a tiny sip. The taste, clean and simple and refreshing, her throat tightened with the effort to swallow, as if her body was still not ready to accept kindness, and her eyes began to sting, but no tears fell. Not yet. David said his name slowly, pointing to himself once, then repeating it, and after a pause he pointed gently to her, not asking, not demanding, just offering, and she looked at him, confused, unsure of what he meant, then realized what he wanted and hesitated before placing her hand on her chest. Her lips moved, barely audible, but she whispered her name, Ida, just one soft word that carried the weight of all her years in silence. He nodded once, repeating the name with careful pronunciation. She blinked, her eyes meeting his for a moment, and something passed between them, not trust, not yet, but something like the first breath of it forming between strangers who had begun to understand each other across a vast and painful distance. Over the next few days, she did not leave the room much, but each morning, David greeted her with a quiet hello. Each night he checked if she had eaten. He never forced her to speak or to move. He left small things near her, a blanket, a soft cloth for her skin, a few simple objects to look at sometimes. He would sit at his workbench fixing broken panels or wires, and she would watch quietly from her spot near the wall. She began to mimic his sounds. Not full words, but pieces of them. She watched the way his mouth moved, how his voice rose and fell, She listened to the soft voices from the screen that spoke slowly in simple tones and repeated the phrases under her breath. Her voice still dry from disuse, but growing stronger each time. One night she finally asked a question, her voice halting and unsure. "Why did you take me?" And he looked up from his seat, met her eyes and said, "Because you looked back at me like a person, not a pet." Her lips trembled with the weight of that answer, her hands gripping the edge of the seat as memories rose again. Images of cold metal, of shouting voices, of her cage being cleaned with her still inside of hands, forcing her to move, to sit, to pose, to be silent all the time, like a thing, not like a living mind. And yet he had seen something no one else had bothered to look for. As the days passed, she began to speak, more slowly, carefully testing each word. She asked about the station, about humans, about the world outside, and David answered with patience, telling her of planets he had never visited, of stars he wanted to see, of his work fixing what others broke, and how sometimes machines were easier to understand than people. She told him bits of her past, not all at once, but in fragments. Her voice low, as if afraid the walls might listen. Her people were peaceful thinkers, artists, not soldiers. They lived on green hills under wide skies. They had no weapons, no armies, only science and dreams. And when the ships came, they had no way to resist. She had been taken young, sold, traded, passed from one place to another, always in a cage, always told to obey, never allowed to speak. Even when she tried, they ignored her or punished her for making noise. David listened, never interrupting, never questioning her memories. He only said, "You're safe now." And each time he said it, she felt something shift inside her, something small and quiet and brave. One afternoon, while he was repairing a broken drone, she walked to his workbench and stood beside him, watching how his hands moved, how he connected wires and realigned circuits. She did not speak, but when he handed her a small tool and pointed to a loose piece, she hesitated, then reached out her fingers, steadier than before. She pressed it into place carefully, and when he nodded, she smiled for the first time. That night she slept not on the floor, but on the soft couch near the wall, wrapped in the blanket he had given her. Her breathing slow and calm, her hands no longer clenched, and her face no longer frozen in fear. And in the quiet hum of the room, David sat at his desk, watching the stars outside the window, and thought of how some cages were made of metal and others of silence, and how breaking them took more than keys. It took someone willing to see what others would not, someone who did not look away. And now the girl who had once lived in chains was beginning to remember how it felt to be whole. The rhythm of life inside the small quarters began to change. Slowly, without loud noise, without sudden shifts, something gentle had begun to grow in the quiet that surrounded them. Each morning, Ina would rise a little earlier, her step still silent, but her movements smoother, her hands no longer twitching with fear, her eyes now calm, though always alert and always curious. David had stopped treating her like a guest or a fragile thing. Instead, he let her move freely around the space, offering her food, but never forcing a schedule, speaking softly when she seemed ready to listen, and working silently when she needed the quiet. And in this silence, Ina began to find her voice, not with sudden words or flowing sentences, but with attempts, awkward and brave, as if learning to speak for the first time. She started pointing at things around the room, asking their names, using just her finger and her eyes, and a curious tilt of her head, and David always answered with simple words. Table, chair, screen, light, door, window. His tone was gentle, never hurried. And each time she repeated a word, he would nod slowly, offering nothing but support and patience. She learned more each day, forming connections between the words and the things they represented, until her thoughts no longer felt trapped inside her mind. She started forming sentences, though the grammar was rough and the sound strange to her own ears, but she spoke because it meant she could finally ask things, share things, understand things that had been hidden behind silence for too long. She watched shows on the screen, basic ones designed for language learning, bright images, simple phrases, friendly voices repeating patterns, and she absorbed everything like a sponge, her mind quick, her memory sharp, and before long she could follow short Conversations between characters on the screen, even laugh at a joke, though it took her time to understand why it was funny. David had added a second chair beside his desk one evening without saying anything, and the next day she sat in it without needing an invitation while he repaired a circuit board. She watched carefully, asking, "What is this? And what does that do?" And he explained without slowing down, treating her like someone who could learn, like someone who deserved answers and respect. Sometimes she would tell him things too, not with full stories, but with fragments of memory, flashes of light, sound, scent, emotion. She remembered a tree on her homeworld with silver leaves that sang in the wind. She remembered her mother's voice, though not her face. She remembered running barefoot through soft grass, before the ships came, before the cages, before the silence. David listened to everything she said, never once telling her to stop, never once turning away when her voice shook or her words stumbled, and slowly the wall between them thinned like ice touched by sun. She began to laugh, sometimes short, sharp, surprised, as if she had forgotten she even could, and he would smile quietly, continuing his work, but always listening. One evening, as the soft hum of the station passed through the walls, Ina sat on the floor by the window, watching the endless stars. Her voice was soft but steady when she spoke. "Do you think they still live, my people?" And David turned to her, thoughtful, before replying, "I think some must have survived. I think someone like you does not come from nothing." That night she dreamed not of cages or chains, but of wide skies and open fields, her feet running fast, her arms reaching toward the wind. And when she woke, she sat quietly for a long time, hands resting on her knees, eyes focused on nothing and everything all at once. Later that day she surprised David by asking him about space, about travel, about what lay beyond the station, and how far the stars truly. When he showed her charts, old maps of nearby systems, planets marked with numbers and letters, moons with strange orbits, gas clouds pulsing with energy, she stared at the screen, fascinated, asking questions, one after another, and he answered each one like a teacher who believed his student could become something great. In one corner of the room, David had placed an old broken drone, a maintenance unit with rusted joints and flickering sensors. Ina noticed it one day and asked if she could try fixing it. He hesitated only for a second, then nodded, handing her a simple toolkit and watching as her fingers moved over the metal. Carefully, cautiously, but with surprising skill, she worked on the drone every evening, learning which wires to reconnect, which plates to replace, which circuits to reset. David guided her when needed, but mostly let her explore her own way, and after several days, the drone finally hummed to life, its lights blinking, its limbs twitching. She laughed aloud at the sight, her joy so full it filled the small room like sunlight. "You did that," he said with a smile, and she looked at her hands as if seeing them for the first time, truly seeing them, and whispered, I fix broken," and the words meant more than. They seemed more than just machines, more than wires. They were about her, about everything she had been through, and everything she was becoming. Language grew stronger, her sentences clearer. She began to ask deeper questions. Why did no one help before? Why do some still buy and sell others like things? Why do they look and not see? David never had easy answers, but he never turned away from her questions. He told her that people could be blind by choice, that many would rather pretend than admit a wrong had been done. Truth was often buried because digging it up was painful, but not everyone was like that, he said. "And you saw something others didn't," she replied, not with anger, but with quiet recognition. And in that moment, something between them changed, not like a flash or a flame, but like a seed finally breaking the surface of the soil, reaching for light. She no longer looked like a caged girl. She moved with purpose. Now she stood tall and asked questions and fixed machines and smiled when something made sense, and laughed when the drone spun in circles. And each time she used her voice, it grew stronger, like a melody returning to a song half forgotten. And in the quiet that followed each day, as they worked and learned and spoke, the memory of chains began to fade, replaced by words, by understanding, by the steady heartbeat of freedom. Growing louder with every breath, she took the days past like whispers, gentle and calm, yet carrying weight in every Moment Ina no longer moved like someone afraid of being seen. She walked freely through the quiet corridors of the lower levels. Her steps light, but no longer uncertain, her head held higher than before, though her eyes still searched the faces of those around her. She began to visit the small learning rooms near the workers' wing, listening to public records, watching galactic archives, reading translated scripts of history, science, and law. She wanted to know not just the words, but the world that had ignored her pain and buried her people beneath false labels. David helped her when she needed guidance, but mostly he watched her grow in silence, proud of her strength and of the fire that now lived behind. Her eyes of fire that did not burn with anger, but with hunger for understanding and for justice. For something she could not yet name. One evening, while sorting through the old data logs from a discarded ship panel, David found something strange, a damaged audio file buried inside a corrupted memory sector. Most would have discarded it, but he was patient and skilled, and slowly he repaired the fragments until the file played a broken voice, speaking in a forgotten dialect that sounded too familiar to ignore. Ina heard it and froze, her eyes wide, her body still. That voice, she whispered. It was my mother. The words were hard to translate, but the tone was filled with warning, urgency, fear, and sorrow. And in those words was the truth that had been taken from her people, had not vanished. They had been hidden, erased from records, and from recognition, classified as non-sentient, not because they lacked thought or language, but because someone powerful had declared them dangerous for reasons no one ever questioned. With David's help, Ina traced the old data to an archived file sealed behind administrative clearance. It took hours of patient coding, rerouting signals, decoding layers of security, but finally they unlocked a portion of it, revealing reports sent by an old official from the Interstellar Council, someone who had once visited her homeworld under the banner of peaceful contact, but whose records told a different story, a narrative shaped by fear and greed and a hunger for control. The report spoke of advanced technology in the hands of Ina's people, energy systems more efficient than anything seen before, communication networks that worked across planetary distances, healing methods based on harmonic resonance, all of it developed without war or conquest or weaponry, and all of it seen as a threat by those who relied on fear to maintain power. The solution had been simple. They declared her kind non-sentient, unable to participate in council discussions or defend themselves under galactic law. They were no longer a people, just a species, no longer voices, just noises. And once that lie was official, the harvesting began. Colonies dismantled, knowledge stolen, individuals captured and sold like pets, like trophies for those who wanted something exotic. And Silentina read the reports without tears, her face still, her hands calm, but her eyes burned with a quiet fury, not for revenge, but for the weight of knowing how much had been taken, how many had been lost, how deeply the lie had been written into history. David sat beside her, saying nothing, offering only his presence as the weight of the truth settled around them like dust from a broken ceiling. And when she finally looked up, she asked not, "Why did they do this?" but "What do we do now?" He did not have an answer at first, but together they began to build one. They gathered what records they could, save them across secure drives, encrypted them, and shared them through anonymous networks. Data pulses sent through back channels, whispering the truth to those who still cared to listen. Some responded with disbelief, others with silence, but a few voices rose in agreement. Others who had seen strange things in the past, who had questioned the classifications and the vanishings, and who now saw the full picture forming before them. Ina began to write not just messages, but statements, declarations, small records of her people, of what they had created and what had been lost, and each file carried her name, not as a pet, not as a subject, but as a witness and as a survivor. And each one ended with the same words, "I am not the last." Her words began to spread across the inner circles of independent researchers and legal advocates, quiet ripples moving outward until they reached the ears of a small but powerful movement, one that had long opposed The silent policies of forced classification, one that believed every voice mattered. A representative contacted David first, careful and curious, and when Ina agreed to speak with them, she told her story not as someone broken, but as someone rising. Her voice steady, her eyes clear, her language firm. Even if her accent still carried the soft music of her native tongue, she told them of the cage, of the silence, of the cruelty masked as legality. She told them of the knowledge her people had held, of the songs that healed and the lights that danced across their cities. She told them of the day she was taken and of the years spent in a box made of metal and misunderstanding. When she finished, they did not speak for a long time, and when they did, they asked not for proof, but for permission to share her words, and she nodded once. Soon after, petitions were filed, investigations requested, files reopened, questions forced into the cold halls of power where truth was often inconvenient, but now too loud to ignore. The council was slow to react, but the pressure built day by day, word by word, truth against silence. Ina did not wait for them to declare her valid. She walked the station freely, now wearing simple clothes, but with a symbol of her people carved into a pendant around her neck, a silver curve with 7 lines representing harmony, life, and memory. She had started teaching others about her culture, not in formal halls, but in quiet gatherings where she showed them how to create sound patterns that could soothe pain, how to grow crystals that responded to voice, how to speak in tones that carried more meaning than words. And those who listened began to see not a rescued pet, but a living thread of something ancient and beautiful and strong. And each time she stood before them, David watched from the edge of the crowd, silent, proud, and full of the quiet certainty that he had not just opened a cage. He had helped return a voice to a world that had tried to forget it ever existed. The station had not changed much on the outside. Ships still came and went, docking with their usual noise and purpose. Traders still shouted in the markets, machines still blinked in coded rhythm, and the hall still echoed with footsteps from 100 different species. But beneath that surface a quiet storm had begun to rise, something invisible to the ordinary eye, yet impossible to ignore for those who had watched the shift unfold piece by piece. And at the center of that shift stood Ina, no longer a shadow in a cage, no longer a silent girl in the corner, but a voice that moved through space with purpose. Her story had reached more than she ever expected. Her words carried from station to station, through data streams and spoken accounts. People who had once walked past cages without thinking now paused and asked questions. People who had accepted the laws without resistance now wondered who wrote them and why. Petitions turned into investigations, official seals cracked under public pressure, and the quiet rebellion of truth turned into a chorus that demanded to be heard, not just for Ina, but for others like her, still held in places where light did not reach. Ina had begun working with a small network of advocates, lawyers, researchers, translators, and even former council employees who had left their posts after learning what had been buried. And each person who joined the cause added something to it: more records, more proof, more voices saying what had been denied for too long, that her people were not lost, that they had never been simple animals, and that the universe had turned away from them, not because they were weak, but because they had shown something rare and powerful. She no longer stayed in the quiet rooms of the worker levels. Instead, she traveled between learning halls, meeting rooms, and public forums, speaking in clear, calm words, always carrying the truth with her, but never with bitterness. She did not seek revenge. She did not scream or threaten. She taught, she explained, she shared, and in doing so she changed minds. Not all, but enough. The council tried to delay their response. Legal reviews were promised. Panels formed. Experts gathered to debate what should be done. But the tide had already turned. A growing wave of public support made silence a dangerous choice, and so after months of pressure, the official message came: her people would be reclassified as sentient beings protected under interstellar law, effective immediately, and all living members found in captivity would be released and returned to their own sovereignty, with full recognition of their cultural and personal rights. Message was delivered in a cold voice from a distant hall far from the pain that had caused it. But to Ina, it meant more than words. It meant that the lie was broken, the label erased. The chain shattered not just for her, but for others like her. And it meant that, for the first time in her life, she belonged to no one. She was free in every sense. She returned to the market where it had all begun, walking past the rows of cages, now mostly empty, the vendor who once sold her gone, replaced by new stalls with no living displays. And as she stood in front of the spot where her cage had stood, she closed her eyes for a moment, remembering the cold floor, the metal bars, the collar around her neck, and then she stepped back, letting the memory pass like a shadow across a bright sky. Later that day she stood before a crowd in the central square, not large but full of faces that looked at her, not with curiosity or pity, but with respect and attention. And as the light from the station's dome ceiling fell across her face, she spoke not from a script, not with rehearsed lines, but from her heart. She told them that freedom was not given, it was recognized, that truth could be hidden but never destroyed, that her people had not vanished, they had only been made invisible, and that every time someone looked away from injustice, they added another layer of silence around a voice that deserved to be heard. She told them that one human had seen her, had seen what others refused to see, and that his choice had changed everything. She did not name David in her speech. She did not need to, because he stood at the edge of the crowd listening. Quietly, his arms crossed, his face calm and proud, and when she finished and the applause rose, he did not move forward or speak, he only nodded, once meeting her eyes across the space between them, and in that moment, no words were needed. Following weeks were filled with more movement, more contact messages from hidden survivors, new names, new places to search, and Ina spent her time helping others find their way back from silence. She met children who had never spoken until they heard her voice. She met elders who had lost hope until they saw her standing tall and strong. And each time she offered them the same thing that had been given to her, a choice to step forward, a space to breathe, and the knowledge that they were not alone. David eventually returned to his work on the lower decks, repairing machines that others forgot, and when Ina visited him one day with a half-broken communication unit, he only smiled and asked her what she had done to it. And as they worked side by side in the quiet of the shop, surrounded by tools and wires, she looked at him and said, "Thank you, not for rescuing me, but for letting me rescue myself." And he replied, only with a small grin and a soft, "You always had the strength." Station carried on its routines, but in the corners of its halls, new voices echoed, voices that had once been silent, now learning to speak in many tongues, in many ways, stories being told that had once been erased. And as more people listened and more truths came to light, the shape of things began to change. Ina never returned to the cage she had left behind, but its memory stayed with her, not as a wound, but as a reminder that even in the darkest spaces, the light of one kind soul could open the path to freedom. So she walked forward into the stars, her voice no longer stolen, her soul no longer chained, her name no longer forgotten, and wherever she went, the galaxy would remember that once she was called a pet, but a human had seen her soul and freed it forever. The end.